My name is Romelia Solano. I'm a double major in political science and Latino studies. I actually became a double major during a very difficult time in my life. And so I'd like to thank everyone in the Latino studies department for the unconditional support and kindness that you have all shown me. I'd like to thank Alicia for welcoming me into the program with open arms from the very beginning. And I would like to thank Professor Lisa Cacho, my absolutely brilliant thesis advisor, for writing the book that has given me the strength to tell the story that I will be sharing with all of you today. And of course, for being her incredibly inspiring self throughout the thesis writing journey. Finally, I would like to dedicate this work to my dad for being the real theorist all along and for teaching me that love transcends all borders, even death. So my senior thesis is entitled Immigrant, Entrapment, Latino Families in the Era of Mass Incarceration and Deportation. And this is an interdisciplinary work that draws from cultural studies, queer studies, and political science. It takes the form of an autoethnographic, but it's less about me, and it's more so about my dad's experience and my family's experience with incarceration and deportation. I actually like to think that this is the story that my dad would have shared if he had the opportunity to do so. But he left me a very powerful cultural archive, 15 years worth of letters, birthday cards, pictures, and memories, conversations ripe with political theory that I did not yet recognize at the time. There's still a lot about his life and his death that I will never know, no matter how much investigating I do. But in the end, I think he left me everything I needed to sort of piece this story together, and the important parts of it, the parts that are not particular to my family's experience, but that tell a much bigger story, a collective story about the 2.3 million children in the United States coping with parental incarceration, and about the 4.5 million children of undocumented immigrants who live every day in fear that their families will be ripped apart. So it's from this vulnerable position, as one of the millions affected, that I believe I can best contribute to an emergent literature on the criminalization and deportability of Latinos. This narrative reveals a great need to change the ideologies in our country that have forced so many children and families to internalize their suffering and cope with the tragic consequences of massive incarceration and deportation in silence. And so I share my family's story because I now find strength in it, and I hope that in a later work I will be able to collect more qualitative data from families like my own who have been deeply affected by these social phenomena. That being said, I typically start by analyzing a poem called The Drug Dealer's Daughter by Sierra Freeman as a cultural text in the introduction of my paper. It's a poem that has really helped me a lot, and I usually like to show it because I think it helps me prepare to share my own story and hopefully prepare the audience to hear it. But for the sake of time, I won't analyze it line by line. I will just play a short clip of it and then use it to transition into the analysis of the cultural archive that my dad left behind. So hopefully this works.
They never tell you about the drug dealer's daughter. 1, she loves Greek mythology. And by the time she learns to love anything more than herself, it's long dead. 2, she is 9 when she realizes she's got the blessing of being brought up in a contemporary concept. She's the first on her block to get a stay-at-home dad, Brad. He plays Barbies and dominoes, and he cooks, y'all. We got enough baking soda in my basement to open 10 bakeries. My daddy is a baker. The cakes, they sell so fast you never see them. Just the customers looking some kind of hungry, like they got a sweet tooth only my daddy can yank. And I swear y'all, we gonna be rich. 3, none of her friends believe her until they all turn training bra and things start disappearing and reappearing in her house. First, Tanya's television set, her older brother's attention, then Danielle's 4-fingered ring and her father's retirement fund, finally Danielle's whole mother. 4, the girl and her father and their family disappear into a new neighborhood. The drug dealer, the father, he never misses a play, a pageant, a slam, and they ain't rich. But they ain't in them projects no more either. 5, by the time I realize what we are, it's already too late. We are an urban novel you will skim over at Walmart, a 4-minute smirk on Fox 8's face. Who would occur if Spike Lee and Quentin Tarantino made a film under Eazy-E's direction? The question Black America asks itself every Sunday. I am a baker with nothing sweet left in it. 6. My father is killed. My father is shot point blank range in the back of the left ear one night, but you probably knew this was going to happen. Saying it out loud makes me feel better, makes this more real. Less magic makes this poem more 10 things you didn't know about C.R. Freeman. Less 10 things about a cliche you can click your fucking teeth at. 7. Some nights I put on my father's chalk outline and I teach it how to walk. My face is a haunted house my mother screams at from habit, not fear. Most days I'm in alleys that no one will enter alone. 8. He is found with no jewelry, just his pocket watch. My baby tooth is snuggled inside. After his autopsy, it is returned to me chipped. 9, I disappear into my old neighborhood, the suburbs. I got an itch the suburbs just ain't got nails for. I find Danielle. She asks me, did I inherit any of my daddy's magic? I shake my head. She abracadabra something into her arms and says, you know, the drug dealer is supposed to die, right? 10. I know the stories. How magic can turn black men into myths, that the hood will turn a black man into a monster, and that Zeus made an exit wound big enough for his daughter to walk out of fully armored, and Athena, like most goddesses, never learned to love anything more than herself.
Amazing. So like I said, this poem has really helped me a lot, and I think that's coming back. And I in my full presentation I go through it, and it's obviously really powerful. And so what is really huge about it is this term that I need you guys to understand, and it's called disidentification. And Munoz defines disidentification, and he says that disidentification is meant to be descriptive of the survival strategies the minority subject practices in order to negotiate a phobic majoritarian public sphere that continuously elides or punishes the existence of subjects who do not conform to the phantasm of normative citizenship. He continues to explain that to disidentify is to read oneself in one's life narrative in a moment, object, or subject that is not culturally coded to connect with the disidentifying subject. It is not to pick and choose what one takes out of an identification. It is not to willfully evacuate the politically dubious or shameful components within an identificatory locus. Rather, it is the reworking of those energies that do not align the harmful or contradictory components of an identity. So Sierra Freeman in her performance has no trouble with this. She candidly gives us imagery of her father as just her father, and also images of her father as a drug dealer. But I've always struggled to talk about my dad and the ways in which he operated outside the legal system. For many years, I felt compelled to defend my dad, to tell his story in a way that would make you value him, or tell it in a way that would hold someone or something accountable for his life and his death. The only way I knew how to do that, however, was by separating him from all the other people who live in this space that some scholars refer to as a space of social death, by saying that somehow he was different, he was not as bad as you'd think, or as bad as people like him are often represented. But separating him from other men in the mass incarceration system was to devalue the lives and the stories that all those people live, and to revalue him by reaffirming that he had some of the characteristics that are valued in the United States was to uphold the very systems of oppression that have controlled every aspect of our lives. I could say that my dad believed in the American dream, and that he passed that dream on to his children. But he made some mistakes along the way. And in telling it this way, and in telling you what upstanding citizens my siblings and I turned out to be, only then does he become valuable, only in his death, and only after downplaying the parts of our lives that are so imperative to our story, the parts that are always already illegal. Only then is he redeemed. I could tell that story, and it would be a very nice story. It might change your mind about him specifically, but it would leave all the other systems that are used to justify the deaths of thousands like him completely in place. And one day you would hear a story on the news about Latino drug offenders being high-priority deportations, and you would forget about me and my dad and my family. and he would vehemently agree that those people deserve to be deported. Therefore, I refused to revalue my dad on the terms of a white, middle-class, heteropatriarchal system of values. Instead, I will revalue him on the terms and values of the immigrant community from which his life was taken. This thesis is my disidentification with the neoliberal economic, criminal justice, immigration, and deportation policies that ultimately led to my dad's violent death. So I was 5 years old when my dad was first incarcerated. He served 8 years in prison at 4 different federal prisons across the Midwest. When I was 13 years old, my dad finally came home and things seemed to be okay for nearly 2 years. Toward the end of the summer before my freshman year of high school, I started noticing that there was something going on with my dad. For months I tried to ignore it. I continued to pretend that everything was okay, until one day I came home from volleyball practice and my mom was crying. My dad had broken his probation and he would be reincarcerated for the rest of my high school years and well into my sophomore year of college. I learned that although my dad was a legal permanent resident, this second offense would be counted as an aggravated felony and grounds for removal upon completion of his sentence. The deportable category of aggravated felony applies to drug and firearm cases, but did not exist until 1996 when the U.S. Congress moved towards expansion of the war on drugs. The first time my dad was incarcerated, he took a plea deal that allowed him to stay in the country as long as he served as a federal government informant. When he breached his probation, he was still under contract with the federal government, but he was detained by the state of Illinois. He fought the charges hard in court, but lost several times, unable to prove that the offense had occurred as a part of his work as an informant. For the next 5 years, we waited. We knew that while he was incarcerated, he was still here, he was still safe, but that eventually he would have to face immigration proceedings. If deported, he would likely also be barred from reentry, effectively exiled from the country where his children were born, where most of his family now lived, and where he had lived for the greater part of his life. The summer before my sophomore year of college, he appeared before the immigration judge asking for asylum on the grounds that as a former government informant, removal would put his life in danger, but his appeal was denied. It is only as of very recently that I've been able to confide the story to my closest friends and college mentors. I have finally been able to open up about my dad's deportation nearly 2 years ago, and how just shortly after his deportation he was killed by the violence in Mexico. I will reflect on my family's experience throughout my analysis as I attempt to understand the intricacies of my dad's case and how the criminal justice and immigration systems work in tandem to create highly deportable, incarcerated non-citizens. I also hope to dispel some important misconceptions about who highly deportable, incarcerated non-citizens are, and how the U.S. government systematically devalues and disposes of their bodies through the entanglements of the bureaucracies designed to control, detain, and ultimately rid the U.S. of these so-called undesirable subjects. Let me be clear. This is not a romanticization of El Chapo, Pablo Escobar, or narcocultura. This is a critique of the very systems in place that make the drug trade possible, that make men of color the criminals of those stories in our head, the stories that pathologize the people instead of the systems that make the drug trade a viable means of survival in the face of insurmountable poverty, making it almost impossible for us to see their decisions to participate in the informal economy as anything other than deviant behavior that should be punished. We cannot see the drug trade as a strategy of survival. We can only see the moral failings of these men of color. They didn't want to work hard enough, or they took the easy way out. That is the story that gets told about men of color in the drug trade, and that is the story I hope to complicate with my research. I'm gonna skip through here because I feel like I'm behind. And so basically I go through and my paper is in sections of my father's incarceration, his deportation, and his subsequent death. And I use my archive, which is all the letters and things that I have from him, to kind of disprove some of those myths inherent in the mass incarceration system about men of color, like absent fathers. I have tons of letters that show that he was very connected with me. This isn't everyone's experience, but this was my experience. And those experiences are contradictions of the myths that are always told. Let me see where. Another reason that I think this research is important, and that some of the people before me have already mentioned, the current literature does little to address the nuanced experience of the growing number of Latinos in the mass incarceration system. While for the past several years, the number of immigration offenders in the prison population has actually outnumbered that of drug offenders. Due to heightened anti-immigrant rhetoric and policing of Latino communities, these numbers have vastly increased. So now where am I? So breaking the law can have many different consequences for different kinds of people. People of color are especially vulnerable. For them, committing a crime justifies punishment through the loss of rights and all too often subsequent death. Blackstone describes this process in the following way: for when it is now clear beyond all dispute that the criminal is no longer fit to live upon the earth, but is to be exterminated as a monster and bane to society, the law sets a note of infamy on him, puts him out of its protection, and takes no further care of him, barely to see him executed. This is the way in which the state legitimized what happened to my dad. And here, this is an article about his death from Mexico. It says, tenía plomazo en la cabeza, so he was shot in the head. And they found his body on the side of an autopista. And when I analyze the article within the paper, I talk about how it's kind of told as just another death, just another number, among the 1,064,345 that have already died in Mexico just between 2007 and 2016. And that's more than the number of people that have died in both the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so I would like to just finish by getting to really the heart of what becomes the conclusion and the building theoretical framework for my paper. And so in Compelled to Crime, Beth Ritchie lays out a theoretical paradigm she terms gender entrapment to describe the cumulative experience of gender identity development of battered black women, which leads to an internalization of violence in their intimate relationships and culminates in their involvement in illegal activities. She argues that the emotional investment that these women put on family life played an important role in the ways in which they established and maintained intimate social and institutional relationships that made them particularly vulnerable to state regulation via the incarceration system. The more these women aspired to live up to heteropatriarchal ideals in their relationships, the more vulnerable they were to gender entrapment. These women were also often from non-normative structured households and had high expectations for themselves that non-battered black women and white women, because they were told they were smart and special in school as young girls. They also strongly believed in the myth of meritocracy, that anyone can get ahead in this country if they just work hard, and thus felt an enormous sense of disappointment when the expectations they had set for themselves did not match up with their lived realities as adults. Similar to Ritchie, I worked towards a theory of immigrant entrapment by analyzing my dad's cumulative experiences from his impoverished childhood and gender identity development as the oldest male of his 10 brothers and sisters in Mexico, and playing a father role for his siblings when his dad left to work in the U.S. through the Bracero program, to his immigration to the U.S. as an adolescent, and his subsequent involvement in the drug trade. I argue that his gender and immigrant identities led to deep investments in patriarchy and the myth of the American dream. These investments would lead to an overwhelming sense of responsibility to lift his entire family out of poverty, and the realization that his positionality made upward mobility exceedingly difficult in the U.S. Furthermore, I argue that his hyper-awareness of the state's exploitation of immigrant labor and a refusal to continue being exploited made participation in the informal economy of Chicago the most viable means for him to gain access to the American dream, not for himself, but for his children and extended family. He believed that in order for his children to have a better life, this was just something that he had to do. And he did not believe that the laws he was breaking compromised his morality. On the contrary, he believed that the good that he was able to do for his family in the U.S. and his community back in Mexico far outweighed the harms of participating in the drug trade. The American dream in this case, in cases like these, works as an ideological apparatus of the state that is designed to support capitalism. Reddy explains this by mapping out the ways in which the home was taken up by the state after World War II to socialize people in accordance with capitalist values. This was done so primarily through the creation of the Federal Housing Association and the implementations of policies that created the internationally coveted American middle class. By giving white heteronormative patriarchal families access to loans to purchase homes and therefore accumulate wealth. When the U.S. created the middle class, they also created informal labor, or racially stratified labor forces. These policies excluded people of color from buying homes and unionizing. These built-in inequalities have been felt throughout history, preventing people of color from upward mobility and effectively creating a welfare state that favored a very specific kind of citizen, or rather subject, the white male head of household. The nuclear family, in turn, serves to reproduce subjects that will conform to those ideologies favorable to the state. Within the life cycle of the Western human subject, long periods of stability are considered to be desirable. People who live in rapid bursts are characterized as immature and even dangerous. My dad lived fast. Too fast Prison was supposed to slow him down. From the age of 16, he started working in the U.S. Oh, this was him when he first came over. And that's actually my grandpa. By the age of 25, he was married and had his first son. By the next year, he was divorced and on his way back to Mexico in search of my mom. By the next year, they were married. By the next year, I was born. By the next year, he realized that he would never have the American dream if he didn't find a faster way of making a living. By the next year, he started drug dealing. In no time, he accumulated a small fortune enough to lift his 10 brothers and sisters out of poverty and get them all steady jobs in the States. After my little brother and sister were born, he moved us out of the city to a small town in the middle of nowhere, Illinois, where he thought he could keep us safe and separate us from his non-normative life. He wanted normativity for our family, but he knew that in order for us to achieve it, he had to exist outside of it. However, I don't know that he thought of this as some great sacrifice. What I do know is that he was okay with living in a different time and space. He did not see himself as immoral or deviant. He constantly questioned the validity of a government that failed to address the needs of its people, and he looked to the informal economy as a way of besting a government that had pushed him out of his homeland and promised him opportunity only to exploit his labor and that of other immigrant workers. He saw this as unjust, and seeing that the government would not grant him or people like him any semblance of justice, he resolved not to let this happen to anyone else in his family. He resolved that if he could not change the system, he could live and work outside of it, and he would find a way to get us, his family, in. During his multiple incarcerations, time slowed down. We all slowed down with him. When he was released during my sophomore year of college, he was deported, and a few months later, he was dead. For some, this death is construed as inevitable. He was a drug dealer. He didn't follow the law or the natural order of things. What would you expect? That's what people think. Or they ask, well, was he doing something illegal at the time? I don't have an answer for that question. I don't know that if his death was random or if it was premeditated. I will never know, because the Mexican government won't investigate it. And the US government exculpated itself from all liability when they deported him. The logic being that because he chose to break the law, not once but twice, because he chose to live his life in a way that was unacceptable to the government, he deserved to be deported. He deserved to die violently and tragically. Querying time allows me to understand the way in which my dad chose to live and to disconnect from the shame always already attached to it by society. He lived with a sense of urgency because incarceration had already cost him too much time. So he lived in the now, and he valued the future, he valued the future according to how he could improve the lives of those he loved while he still lived. This is not to say my dad didn't want a future. I'm sure that he did. We talked about the future quite a lot, but I think he always saw himself existing outside of the normative futures we imagined. I don't think he ever planned on slowing down, not really. He always had bigger plans. They were not restricted to the confines of the law. During one conversation when I visited him in Mexico, just 2 short weeks before he was killed, he referred to himself as a slave of the state, but he said that through education maybe we, his children, could escape. Sadly, the chains of racism are too great. We will never fully escape that, and the trauma of his violent death will follow us wherever we go, for as long as we live. Although my dad lived faster than I would have wanted, too fast for me or anyone to hold on to, he lived in his own way. In the 49 years that he lived, he did a lot more living than most of us ever do. This thesis is a poem about my dad. Thank you all for listening.
One question.
I'm sorry if it was really sad and depressing.
You said a bit, I think, on the first slide, that your dad is a real theorist. Could you share, I mean, you said something just at the end about being a slave of the state. I mean, is there more that you could share about him being a kind of an organic intellectual?
Yeah, and it's really strange. I've always had conversations with him growing up where he was sort of telling me these things and trying to get me to understand them, and I was always kind of still thinking in very normative ways. I still very much wanted, the nuclear family household. And I believed in the American dream for a really long time. And so I wasn't getting it, and I was like, no, you're just wrong.
So he was a critical theorist. Right?
Yeah. And the thing is, with cases like him and others that I've read, is a sort of criminal consciousness of living, outside the bounds of the law, but not necessarily compromising your moral beliefs. So he had a very strict moral ethical code, and he was definitely very insistent that my siblings and I have that same moral ethical code. He was just okay with operating outside of that in accordance with the law when he felt that it was necessary. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question fully. Thank you.